This is a special edition of Sunday Focus, a public affairs program that looks at the topics affecting our society and the people who are making a change in the community each and every day. This special edition is presented by Information 1000 KSOO and Results Radio. This week, follow along as we educate and inform you on sex and labor trafficking. Now your host, Jeff Harkness.
I'm Jeff Harkness, and welcome to part one of a special 5-part series on human trafficking in South Dakota. Part one, we'll look at the issue of sex trafficking, and we're joined by Assistant U.S. Attorney Jeff Clapper, Call to Freedom Executive Director Becky Rasmussen, Melissa, a sex trafficking survivor, and Keystone Treatment Center's Director of Business Development and Marketing, Erik Miller. Jeff, let's start with you, and let's start with just a basic definition. When we talk about trafficking, it's not one size fits all. What does that mean to the average person, and what kind of forms does it take?
When we're talking about trafficking, we're basically talking about compelling somebody to be involved in a commercial sex act. It can take many forms. The statute, the federal code, tries to encompass everything in the chain of commerce, not just your pimps, but anybody that assists them to helping transport, harbor, and even the customer. And the reason that's important is there's a case here in South Dakota that we prosecuted that the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals determined that the customer is meant to be included in the statute the way that it was written. But just to make sure, Congress, following up on our case, wrote it into the code to make sure that anybody that even solicits for this would be included in prosecution for this offense.
Because it takes on so many forms, is the law effective in covering everything, or are there still instances that kind of fall in between the cracks and fall into the gray areas?
I would say everything is covered.
Okay.
But for a federal prosecution, we have to have an interstate nexus. So this isn't just a prostitution matter happening on a street corner. We have to have a federal nexus, something that crosses the interstate line. So typically we're going to have some type of advertisement on the computer, or there's a cell phone involved. There's been other ways that we've reached it, but we haven't had any problems getting federal prosecution based on that.
All right. So, Becky, let's talk about Call to Freedom and the local response and what your organization does and what your organization sees locally.
Yeah, Call to Freedom is a 501c3 nonprofit that offers supportive services to victims and survivors of human trafficking. And so everybody's journey is different who walk through the doors of Call to Freedom. What we have seen quite a bit of is actually 3 types of trafficking. Event trafficking, which we talk about the Sturgis Rally, we talk about hunting season, but we've also seen what's called familiar trafficking or homegrown trafficking, which is family members trafficking their own children, aunts, uncles trafficking or selling individuals for sex, for just to receive money. And then also, like Mr. Clapper talked about, is the transit trafficking, where they groom, recruit in one state, but they'll take them across state lines to traffic them in another state. And so we're seeing a lot of different ways that they're coming through our doors. And so what happens when they come to the doors of Call to Freedom is we work with referral sources. You'll hear from Keystone. We work with Children's Inn, domestic violence shelters. We work with law enforcement. We work with those who come in first contact with those that are potentially trafficked. 3% of victims are ever identified, which means 90+% of people never are identified. And so one of the things that we want to do is be proactive and make sure that we're going into communities, equipping, educating, and letting them know what does it look like and what questions do we need to ask. A lot of trafficking victims, because of that 3%, don't even know they're being trafficked when they're being trafficked. So helping them identify that and to be able to get the services. So we then provide case management, which means connecting them with any type of services they need to get back on their feet. It may be housing, it may be some of the addiction issues that we're going to be talking about today, or it could be just finishing their education. But for a lot of them, it's that mental health piece, that addiction piece, and that getting them stabilized in housing. A lot of them will come out and have been, because of their trafficker, had felonies, misdemeanors, and so getting housing, getting education, getting jobs is very difficult. Complex trauma, so once they come into and get out of that life, they have to function in a job, and PTSD and anxiety is very real. So we come alongside them, we start walking life with them, we help them financially with any needs that they need, but also service-wise. And for a lot of individuals we work with, we become their family because their family has been the one that has victimized them. And so it's just important to make sure that we're supporting them in that process.
And freedom is in your name, and in a large sense, the freedom has been taken away from these people. And so I imagine there are times when people don't have a lot of coping mechanisms because all of that control has been taken out of their lives.
So what we do is, in some of them, we've had individuals who have walked to our doors who have been trafficked for 3 months. And we had one woman who was trafficked for over 50 years of her life. And so you can imagine, based on that trauma, how do you enter back into life? What does life look like? And we just expect once they're out, they're going to go back to normal life. And that doesn't happen. And there's a lot of triggering. There's a lot of complex trauma. They get into work environments. They're very familiar. And they don't know how to cope with that, just like you said. And so coming alongside them, getting them the services, developing a structure within their life, a routine within their life, and also having that support when they do hit an area of their life that they're not equipped to be able to handle, if that's financially, physically, or mentally, that support's there to service them.
Melissa, let's talk about you and your story. You've worked with the folks at Call to Freedom. Your situation involved family, and yet you weren't able to identify at first what your situation was, and that sounds fairly common.
Correct.
So talk about your situation and take us back and kind of give us a sense of what you went through.
Mine was homegrown, and when it happened, my mom would call it a tickle game. So the guys would take me to the room and have sex with me. I didn't know what it was, and still, it took quite a long time before I knew something wasn't right. And when they finally identified it, they called it rape. It was not human trafficking. So they put me in rape counseling, which did absolutely the exact opposite of what it was supposed to do. So many years I just dealt with the memories just squashed in the back of my mind until just something triggers them, and it could be anything. I mean, like Becky was talking about, it took me 250 applications to get a job because I have a felony, because of stuff's going on. And you don't know how to live a life. I mean, here, I didn't expect 8 years later to still be struggling with the memories or the consequences or dealing with day-to-day life as being a survivor. And then I'm a person that's not, I don't want people to, let's feel sorry for her, because that's not how we want to feel.
When did you put the pieces together and figure out exactly what had happened to you?
I was sitting in, before it was called Call to Freedom Be Free, with Susan Omason, and we were talking, and I said, there's just something in my mind and I don't know what it is. So we just kind of started talking about memories. Because when what happens is, what I went through is I disassociated with the problem. My body lived through it, but my mind was somewhere else. So when I disassociated, they dealt with it. So I had alters. So it was just like there was triggers and smells could take you back to something, and you would never know it.
So how has Call to Freedom helped you put your life back together?
They've been amazing. They have opened so many doors for me. I mean, I didn't know that counseling, I've been going through trauma counseling, where we're going back to those memories and being able to be around the people, because I cannot be around certain guys because of the smells or something. So learning how to deal with that, learning the triggers so that you don't fall back into it. Financially, they help, when they can. It's like, I've called Becky, it's like, what do I do? I'm in this situation. And they talk me through it, and my counselor's great. They've been there emotionally when I can just call upset, had a bad day at work. They're right there. It takes a team to do this. I mean, if I had to do it by myself, I would not be still.
Sure.
There's been times that I would sit in Susan's office and just let me go back to jail. Because it was a controlled environment.
We'll have more of our special series on human trafficking in South Dakota in moments. Please stay with us.
Bikers Against Child Abuse, BACA, exists with the intent to create a safer environment for abused children. We exist as a body of bikers to empower children to not feel afraid of the world in which they live. We stand ready to lend support to our wounded friends by involving them with an established, united organization. If you'd like to know more about BACA, please visit our website at BACA.org. acaworld.org or call 1-866-71-ABUSE.
Welcome back to our 5-part series on human trafficking in South Dakota. We continue our discussion of sex trafficking with Assistant U.S. Attorney Jeff Clapper, Call to Freedom Executive Director Becky Rasmussen, Melissa, a sex trafficking survivor, and Keystone Treatment Center's Director of Business Development and Marketing, Erik Miller. Jeff, because it's difficult even for victims sometimes to identify what they've gone through, does that make prosecution more difficult sometimes?
It's very difficult. We have many cases that we've detected and found people that have been trafficked, and they don't know it, similar to Melissa. They come in all ages, from teenagers to adults into their 30s and 40s, 50s. They've been coping in their life situation in such a way that that's become the new normal for them. So that when we find them and try to rescue them from their situation, they don't. First of all, many of them are distrustful of law enforcement. They've been lied to, manipulated, and coerced for quite a period of time. So when the police show up and they say they're there to help, they don't believe them. But even when we convince them of that, so many of the victims that we deal with have addictions, and either through drugs or alcohol. They may have some mental problems. They may have some other issues, the disassociation from family or any type of support network, that when we're trying to work with them to get them into a courtroom to testify about some of the most awful things that could happen to somebody, and certainly the most private kind of things that can happen, it's more than many of them can handle, and that affects our cases.
And Jeff, you mentioned substance abuse, and of course, Erik, Keystone, we know, is a well-known substance abuse center here in town. What do you see as the correlation between substance abuse and trafficking from your standpoint?
Well, I think, first off is how we became introduced with Becky. Went to one of their monthly meetings. I believe it was, 2-3 years ago? Heard from, I believe, Melissa, you spoke that day, amongst other victims. And I remember that was when we had the bakery and we had kind of this community hub, and I was recommended to go there. And I thought in my 30-some years of this field that I'd heard everything, but I hadn't. And I remember in that 90-minute time frame of not only becoming informed, but just literally had a fire within me that we must find a way to help. The spirit of Keystone is this outreach, and immediately I approached Becky, who I did not know at that time, and I said, my name's Erik Miller, I'm with Keystone. I don't know how we can help, but I'm here to figure it out. Since that time, we have worked diligently, because the response system for, I think, the victims in this population are very unique. They face challenges that, and there's enough barriers to getting into a treatment program, good God. But they have additional barriers and challenges that we had to address. And we're still working this system out. But I think now, after 2 years, what we've learned and what we've tried to implement within our center, and even more importantly, our outreach, on how we respond when, Becky, a flare comes up from Call to Freedom that we need someone to come because we have another victim here that probably needs your services, is our response time in the beginning, for a multitude of reasons, being mobile in our assessment, securing funding, because funding, again, is a major barrier, is we've went from several days now to hours. To where they're identified, assessed, we get approval from the state. I have to give kudos to the state of South Dakota and the work that they've done to try to meet the needs and expedite that funding approval process. And then, because of safety issues, which are completely different, they're always a threat of being kidnapped early on, re-trafficked. We have to move quickly. And so our traditional delivery system was not adequate at any way, shape, or form. So what we see again is whether they have used to cope or whether they have used against their will as a control mechanism, is that a good high percentage of these folks are in needing of services. I also met, with Jason Ravnsburg and from the state, and the idea, like we were talking here, of the ability to have a good witness, because what they're going to do is they're going to try to delay this court as long as they can, because they, of the belief that that witness will not be there a year from now. It's vital that we were there and that we deliver the type of services that can actually, I think, begin in our center and then continue through a really good wraparound process. And I can't give Becky and her team enough credit. It is brilliant, the way things have come together and how quickly they've come together. We've had a higher success rate with these victims, which you would believe would be the highest risk for relapse than probably any population we've worked with. And that's because I think it's the community coming together, knowing that we all can't do it all, that we have to work together, and that I'm just so proud. It still tears me up to stop and think about this issue. I was completely unaware of it until I went to that deal, and I think most people are. If you don't live in that realm, it's kind of hard to have a point of reference.
Yeah.
But we just want to be there. We want to continue to deliver services that are not only effective, but do it in such a way that we can get that service delivery timeline, really as tight as we can. So
Yeah, we've really worked on streamlining that process. Just as Erik said, that it's a short period of time that you really have to keep this victim to survivor. And so the ability for them to re-recruit, this isn't just like a domestic violence situation. These are multiple people that are involved with this particular victim. And so you can put a protection order on a trafficker, but you got his little cohorts, which we call a ring, that are also a effect and are a safety issue, but also they're trying to deter them from getting any help or to saying anything to law enforcement. And so this has been a great opportunity to work with the community, and the community has responded to the needs of victims of human trafficking, from the addiction to the domestic violence shelters to law enforcement to just those that are on the front lines, the medical community, which we'll hear from. And the needs of survivor are so complex. They need all of those services to come together in a very short time to be successful.
We'll have more of our special series on human trafficking in South Dakota in moments. Please stay with us.
Listen, you want to help people. We all do. But if you can't help everybody, why help anybody, right? Wrong. When you give to the Sioux Empire United Way, 1 out of every 3 people in the Sioux Empire benefit from your donation one way or another, whether they even know it or not. Look around. You could help 1 out of every 3 people you see. It's simple. Every little bit you give helps 1 in 3 everybody's around you. Get involved and give to the Sioux Empire United Way today at SCUW.org. It's the easy way to do good.
Welcome back to our 5-part series on human trafficking in South Dakota. We continue our discussion of sex trafficking with Assistant U.S. Attorney Jeff Clapper, Call to Freedom Executive Director Becky Rasmussen, Melissa, a sex trafficking survivor, and Keystone Treatment Center's Director of Business Development and Marketing, Erik Miller. Jeff, let's go back to prosecution, because obviously you can't prosecute something without proof. I would imagine proof, in some instances, proves to be elusive in situations like this.
It can be very difficult, because here, like a rape situation, all we have is the word of our victim. And so we're looking for other ways to prove that. So a lot of times we have the online advertisements. We have cell phone records. If we're able to find the suspect, we might be able to find credit card receipts, check up with the hotels, the places where these events occurred. Those are our most common pieces of evidence. A lot of times we're dealing with multiple victims. Some of the most successful prosecutions and trials that we've had here in Sioux Falls, we've had multiple victims testify. Their testimony from each other corroborates what happened to each one of them.
And then, Becky, let's talk about the corrections part of it, in that because people's lives have been turned upside down and been changed so much, a lot of these victims end up becoming criminals themselves and having to go through the system themselves. And Melissa talked about being an ex-felon. What percentage of people and how often is it that you deal with people that are incarcerated because their lives have been so affected by this?
Yeah, I think complex trauma has many different effects, and so it affects your choices, right? And so a lot of them have been in that environment, so sometimes it's a choice, but a lot of times it's their trafficker forcing them to do these scenarios, and we're not identifying them. Mm-hmm. And we had a young girl that we worked with who actually was pulled over several times by law enforcement, and her trafficker was in the car with her. And the questions weren't asked. And, you know, she said, well, didn't they see that he was, you know, forcing me in here? But she had distribution and possession charges. And it's not that the law enforcement weren't doing their job. I never want to say that. Sure. I think it's education. I think it's trainings. It's communicating, but also recognizing that prostitution, pornography, those things are not victimless crimes. There are victims that are involved with this. I always say, when you're a 3 or 4 year old, you ask them, what do they dream of when they grow up? How many of them say, I want to be a prostitute mm-hmm. or be involved in pornography? They don't. And so what we have to do is stop looking at some of these individuals who are in prostitution as criminals, but also looking at them, they could be potential victims. There are some that we work with that are now choosing prostitution. You know why? Because they've been victimized at an early age. They never finished their education. They never had the opportunity of support of family to be able to make better choices. So what do? You can make $10 an hour working for a Citibank or a local card company, but you have complex trauma. So you can't actually function in that job, being around lots of people, these smells, and then they trigger within those situations. And so a lot of them feel forced to go back into some of those lifestyles that we call criminal activity because they don't know any different. And so I think a lot of it is education. I think a lot of it is support. If we can intervene with youth at a younger age in their victimization, we can be way more successful of breaking some of those patterns in people's lives of those criminal choices. And so I think a lot of it is intervention. I think a lot of it is identifying and being better at identifying when they're going through these systems. And then what are our responses? How are we responding to once we identify a victim? I tell you this, if we identify a victim, we don't respond, but we respond, but it's not successful, mm-hmm. they're never going to come back and talk to us again. And so we really have to look at the system as a whole. We're going into the prisons, we're going into the jails, we're connecting with these women that are in there that have been victimized, that had probably made those choices along the way because of the identity crisis they had at a very young age. So I think there's a lot of education, and they need support. You know, to come out when somebody has been controlled all of their life, they don't know how to balance a checkbook. They don't know how to find an apartment. I would be overwhelmed with the systems just being a normal person today because it is very overwhelming. And then we ask somebody who's come out of a victimized situation to go back into life without support. And it's very, very difficult and a lot of times not successful.
So, Jeff, when we hear more about trafficking these days, is it because there are more instances of trafficking or because we have a better awareness of what trafficking is?
We certainly have a more awareness of it, especially in South Dakota, here in Sioux Falls. Law enforcement is more aware of it. You know, before 2010, we didn't have any sex trafficking prosecutions in South Dakota. Since then, it'd take me a few minutes to count them all. And law enforcement made a very focused effort to investigate these crimes, to detect them, and to follow up. And our office does our best to prosecute them. And the courts here in South Dakota take them very seriously. We've had 3 defendants that were sentenced to life sentences for sex trafficking. That's how serious an offense this is. And Sioux Falls is also geographically situated such that it's 4 hours from Minneapolis, mm-hmm. 10 hours from Chicago, a little further from Milwaukee. We get traffickers from Omaha and Des Moines, Chicago, and sometimes they're just passing through looking for new markets. Yeah. Sometimes they're on their way up to the oil fields in North Dakota. Sioux Falls is right on 29 and Interstate 90, and it's got a big enough metro area that they will come here for a week or a weekend, open shop, post things online, bring in their victims from other states. They're here for a short time and then they move on. If they're successful, they come back. And that's the history of investigations that we've had here in Sioux Falls.
And you mentioned the internet, and I imagine that has made it that much easier for the traffickers to find victims.
It is. It's hard to know exactly how they're finding them. You know, what I do know from the cases that we've worked on is the perpetrators of this know how to find vulnerable victims.
Yeah.
They know how to find the girls, the women that are desperate. They're either poor, they're addicted to drugs or alcohol. They're in a situation where this person makes the appearance of being able to provide something that they don't have. And that's when they get sucked in to sex trafficking, and then he manipulates them through force, fraud, or coercion of some kind.
Melissa, I want to turn to you again. Now that you've kind of gone through the other side of this, what is your message to people that may even think that they might be going through something like this?
Tell someone.
Just that simple.
There's signs. I mean, I think when it happened to me, I think if there was more awareness of it, it would probably stop a lot sooner. But nobody knew about it back then, what it was called.
And like I said, identifying and the education is important too, because like you said, you weren't even aware what was going on in your own situation.
Yeah.
Becky, let's talk about, we got just a couple minutes left. Let's talk about the role of family in all this, because in Melissa's case and so many other cases, and it's horrible to even consider the option, but family is part of this in some instances.
You know, like Mr. Clapper said, that traffickers look for vulnerability, right? And the familiar trafficking, a lot of times, just like Melissa said, she didn't know what was happening to her because the people you trust the most are grooming you to sell you. That's all you've ever known. The youngest one that we've heard is starting at, well, I think one of the youngest ones that we know, starting age 3, she was introduced to pornography by her dad, introduced to alcohol at age 3. From age 3 to age 7, he sexually abused her. From 7 to 18, he sold her to her friends. She didn't know any different. This is the man that she trusted, who was supposed to provide for her and take care of her, who actually groomed her and sold her and made money. And so that just started this whole spiral. She didn't know until she walked into a domestic violence shelter. They asked her 3 questions that she was a trafficking victim. And so what we want to do is break the silence. Just like Melissa said, we want to talk about it. A lot of times, like we said, most trafficking victims don't even know they're being trafficked because it's somebody that they trust, somebody that is supposed to take care of them and protect them. And so if we can break the silence and talk about what does it look like, talk about the signs, then we're going to have people self-identifying, coming forward. But we also have to have the support in place, because when they come out, if it is a family member or somebody they trust, then who do they turn to?
Right.
And that's a lot of the times what traffickers will do is they will keep them in controlled situations, saying nobody's going to believe you, number one. And number two, where do you have to go? Do you want to go to the system and live in the system? Because that's your next choice. I'm here to tell you, if you are, any of these signs sound very familiar to you, and you identify them, that there is help for you, and that we're going to be there to support you in that process out of that lifestyle. And so what I want to say today to those that are potentially victimized is that there is support there to leave this life.
Call to Freedom Executive Director Becky Rasmussen, Melissa, a sex trafficking survivor, and Keystone Treatment Center's Director of Business Development and Marketing, Erik Miller. I'm Jeff Harkness. Join us next time for part 2 of our series as we focus on labor trafficking. Thank you for listening.
This has been a special edition of Sunday Focus, a public affairs program of Results Radio Town Square Media, Sioux Falls.